Memoirs of Dr. Mehdi ضرغامی, February 28, 1985, Arlington, Mass. Interview Shahle Haili. Dr. ضرغامی, I want to ask you the same questions I lost last time before we were cut off. Were there students who would want to write a newspaper praising the Shah's policy?
I'm sure that there were students who were pro-regime or did not feel any danger from the direction and the speed of development of Iran and all the political connotations of it. However, if a person does not feel a danger, he is apt to not do anything. In other words, the political system in Iran was not so that a person had to really sell anything or defend anything. The defense of the ideas of Shah was made by Shah's regime, and the open environment wasn't there, so there was no threat. As a result, you didn't have too many students who would stand up and be counted on the side of the Shah. If the system were more open, I would imagine that there would have been people who would want to stand up and be counted in that regard. But the need never arose. If anybody screamed, there was a danger of getting caught by Savak. I mean, this was more danger than real opposition. However, there were oppositions amongst the different factions of the dissidents. I mean, there were people who had more religious ideas as opposed to Marxist ideas. They were always fighting with each other. But the fighting was conducted in such a way that was totally obscure to the government. But definitely there were a number of occasions in which the oppositions fought and fought harshly. In fact, I remember that Sharif was a student who of Aryama University, and he was a member of Mujahideen. He was very much religious, and he opposed the creeping communist ideas in Mujahideen organization, and he was essentially murdered by Mujahideen. Yeah, another student was pushed from the 4th floor of the dormitory of Aryama University. He smashed his head on the asphalt and was killed. And
who pushed him?
It was never known. Although there were students around, they even never cooperated to the extent of finding who did it. But it was definitely this incident, like killing of Sharif, was politically motivated.
When you say Mujahideen murdered him, how did they do them? How did they murder
Well, they
Sharif?
took him, the Sharif was taken, well, there was a guy, another student called Shahram. He wasn't, I don't believe he was the student of, Shahram was his last name. Shahram was not a student of Aryama University, and he was pushing for Marxist ideology, and Sharif was a student of Aryama University, and he opposed the creeping Marxism, because and also the decision that was being made at that time by Mujahideen to abandon the Islamic foundation part and go more and more lean toward Marxism, because they somehow felt the danger of leaning too much toward Islam, the danger that finally happened to them. I mean, the thing would fall ultimately in the hand of mullahs and or extremist Islamic extremists, and therefore they thought that sometimes in 1970s, early 1970s, was ripe time to divorce from the Islamic principles and go more and lean more and more toward Marxism. This idea faced an opposition among some of the factions in Mujahideen organization, and one of the outspoken members was Sharif, who was murdered by Shahram and others. This became quite clear after revolution, when Shahram was imprisoned by the regime immediately after revolution.
So no charges were brought against anybody?
Well, they couldn't. Well, I don't know. I don't. No, charges were not brought against Shahram. At least it wasn't known to the regime that who had done it. They knew that it was an action of Sazman Mujahideen, but they didn't know who had done it. If they would have found Sazman Mujahideen members, I mean, top members, I think they would have imprisoned or killed them anyway. I mean, so whether it was for the murder of Sharif or not, that would be immaterial.
Thank you. Which of the Ariamer University students who were later imprisoned or executed did you know personally?
I think that there was one student that I knew personally, in the sense that I was his faculty advisor, and there were a number of them who were in my classes, and I knew only their faces. The one that I knew personally was, I think his name was Olumi. I know that he was in prison. There was another student who was not a member of Sazman Mujahideen. He was just an outspoken critic of the regime. His name was Etrat, and he was in prison. Etrat. He was in prison for several years. There were a large number of other students who were in prison for shorter time and periods. There were amongst them is Ibrahim Hendinejad, who was in prison for a few months, and I knew him relatively well. He was niece or nephew of Khomeini, and there were others who were members of the Mujahideen organization, or they were compatriots of, not necessarily an active member, but they had supporting feelings towards them. I would say altogether I probably knew about 10 of such persons who were either imprisoned or killed. I'm just thinking about the name of a person who was Chermani, and he went to he carried a bomb to Kurosh, a department store, and somehow the bomb exploded in his hand in the bathroom. I think he may have been hesitant of whether to plant that bomb or not. And finally, he was severely damaged and imprisoned afterwards. You know.
Could you describe some of these individuals? I mean, like you said, describe some of those kinds.
By and large, they were not outspoken. The ones I am specifically referring to the terrorist members of the Mujahideen or Fadaiyan. First of all, Aryamer University didn't have, I don't think that they had a lot of members of the Fadaiyan organization. Whoever I knew there were belonging to the Mujahideen organization. By and large, they were introvert. They did not mingle well with other students even. They rarely attended class, at least toward the end of the time of their capture. I mean, Ulumi first year, maybe he was a okay student, but later on he became, you felt a depression in their, or a depression feeling in their attitudes. They were very much eager to pass the courses, so they came toward the end of the course and they wanted to get a grade and take the exams and this sort of thing. And I had the policy that I wanted to see the students all through the year, and usually I ended up talking to these people. Where were you? Why didn't you take the interim exams? Where are your homeworks? And this sort of things. And he would answer in a confused, lost way that you would know that here we go again. And if somebody from Berkeley made this was during late 1960s, early 1970s, made a distinction between two groups of, between various students by dividing them according to whether they had psychological or social alienation. By psychological alienation, we mean somebody who is not who has feelings of loneliness, of inability, powerlessness, etc., etc. By social alienation means somebody who doesn't agree with the trends, pace, or direction that the society is developing. A number of students were socially alienated, and they used to sit down and talk and discuss, and they wanted to actively participate in everything, and they wanted to improve the society. You would see them as they spoke. They were against the government or against the direction that the country was going, but at their heart there was an idea for development. There were other students who were psychologically alienated. They were either withdrawn from the society, or they were terrorists when they became extremely socially alienated as well. It was probably a result of their upbringing, or because of the shattering of their value system in a rapidly developing society of Iran. What was happening in Iran was this, that the entire value system of the students, especially those that came from the more remote places, were being changed. And kid who had come from a small town was and had sort of religious upbringing. He came necessarily from a poor family. He saw the lavish of the Tehran, and he saw all the corruptions, and he saw even girls and boys going out on dates. He couldn't digest that, and he definitely felt there was something wrong with him. He couldn't possibly mix with this society. Where are the principles? And he at the same time was being attracted to these, and he had to resist, and there was this tremendous fight within his inner system. Now add to that some social alienation, a lot of social alienation, and you would have your terrorists. And they were very withdrawn. They did not talk even to their fellow students, etc., etc. At the same time, I can also see that they had much higher things in mind. So they knew that they were going to lose their lives on that. I mean, that's a big decision, and I can see why you would get depressed. Or, I mean, now which one came first? Was there social and psychological alienation that led into terrorists, or was it really getting into terrorism and then by nature you become psychologically and socially alienated? I don't know, but what I saw was a manifestation that was clear to me, a social and psychological alienation simultaneously. But by and large, the students who had social alienation, they developed into ordinary people in Iran. I mean, they would criticize, etc., and then they graduate and find a job in plan organization, this place, this company, that company, and they would lead a normal life. The people who had extreme psychological alienation, you would know something is going to go wrong.
If we may take a concrete example, let's take Ulumi. I mean, all these characteristics you mentioned, does it fit Ulumi? Or
yeah, I think Ulumi would fit that. Ulumi would fit the psychological alienation. In the first year, he was normal. In the second year, he was withdrawn. In the first year that he was normal, he really came from a poor family. He had religious background and upbringing, and he had problems in the first year, but he coped with those problems in some way. In the second year, he was really withdrawn. By the beginning of the third year, I heard that he was involved in one of those incidents that led either to his arrest or anyway he was involved in some sort of a terrorist activity, and then he was captured, and later on I heard that he wasn't captured, but anyway we knew that we had lost Ulumi. It was just a matter of time when he would be captured, murdered, or killed.
Was there an organization within Aryana University that would recruit these students? I mean, how does
I have to answer you by guessing. I would say that the students who belong to Mujahideen organization would have a technique of expanding their organization, and essentially would be looking for the people who have social and psychological alienation who would join them. And I think that the way that it was done very gradually by asking them first to gather in such a place and scream against government. I mean, one of the demonstrations. Now, demonstrations were very confined demonstrations, but it was announced in the day before in specific places. And secondly, they would maybe give them a bunch of literature to distribute, or placed in certain places that it would be picked up by the other students. And once they developed a trust in him and involved him with various activities, I think gradually they would absorb him into the organization. But I can see that in order for somebody to really become absorbed into the organization at that time, it would have taken many months or years of hard work until they would qualify. The initiation would not be that easy. I mean, they couldn't recruit on a short-term basis.
Approximately how many Al-Yamer University students were at one time or another imprisoned or executed?
Well, you have to distinguish between the two. I have to say that there were two kinds of imprisonments in Iran. One form of imprisonment was associated with non-terrorist groups. It was maybe a technique of the government in order to show to the average students that you shouldn't really go after the terrorists. Essentially, if there was a meeting and if one of these kids were available, or if they knew that this guy has some books or has some pamphlets or literature and this sort of thing, they may go to his house and arrest him. Usually such arrests were for short period of time. Many students got arrested in this way or by mass arrest in demonstrations inside the campus. I know that after a demonstration in 1950, I was selected by the faculty to go and see if any of the kids were lost their lives, and this was after a severe beating that was given to the students of Al-Yamer University that year, about a month after Siyakal event. I went with the permission of Rais Police. At that time I was working with Dr. Reza Amin, who was Chancellor of the university. I was in charge of a newly formed Office of Planning and Development. Anyway, I went. I was elected by the faculty, and permission was obtained by the Chancellor, and I visited the prison where about several hundred students were kept temporarily for a few days. And afterwards, they released the students. They went home. Anyway, in that event, we had about 1/4 of the student body inside prison. When I became Chancellor, I requested the name of all the kids who have in some manner not attended and the list came out, and it was again a couple of hundred.
Not attended classes?
Not attended classes. Well, some of them may have left for Europe, but by and large they would have been in prison or something like that. So there were a couple of hundred, but gradually they came back during from 1975 to 1977. We had a return from prison. Apparently what happened must have been something like this, that sometimes in 1975, this is the same year that Shah declared Rastakhi's party, they gathered a lot of people and put in prison. And later on, from 1975, when they also passed a law of the law was this, that if somebody is accused of some offense in the judgment of the Attorney General, his sentence can be increased by threefold, according so that social problem or whatever problem that they have would be dealt with. Now, as a result, if previously you would get 3 years imprisonment for insulting Shah, now it was changed to 10 years. It was horrible. But something happened as a result of that. The phenomena that happened was this, that they had a large number of people in prison that they were keeping almost indefinitely because of this triple factor. I mean, and if a guy was 2 years in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, which was previously considered a short imprisonment, it was changed to 6 years, 9 years, 12 years. Now this was enormous. Then sooner or later they stopped, the government almost, the Savak stopped gathering people in that manner. No more people were captured as before. Now that may be associated with Carter and human rights and this sort of thing, I know. But also they had picked up a stone, I mean, too large for them to be able to throw it. So they collected all those people. I think they must have run out of space, I mean, physical space, and just management of the prisons. Anyway, that must have been a problem. But anyway, Shah, after in 1976-77, claimed that there are only 3,000 political prisoners. If his number was correct, then at that time, 1975, we must have about 200, 250 of them probably belong to Aryamed University, which is somewhere around 8 to 10% of the, well, that shows how important maybe Aryamed University was. But toward the end of my time as Chancellor, I think the number had dropped down significantly. Amongst the second category are those that were actively pursuing terrorism. I mean, those who really wanted to kill and die. And I would say there weren't that many of them, probably 10, 12, 15, that I would know that they lost their lives, something of that nature. Or were imprisoned, but such imprisonments were equivalent to losing life. Or even if it wasn't equivalent, I'm categorizing it as such. It wasn't for having Das Kapital, I mean, on your shelf.
If you think you have answered some of these questions, please feel free to.
I really can't tell you because I don't know. I mean, I have a feeling that I've answered all of these questions, but because of the tape problem, I can't distinguish whether it was I've answered it or not. So you may have redundancy.
That's all right.
I apologize for redundancy, but that's your fault also.
That's right. Absolutely. Well, here, this is one of those questions which is on the border, but I'm going to ask you again and you see what we can do with it. How much did you know about the alleged crimes or the trials?
Nothing. We knew that these people were, I mean, the people that, well, let me go back. And I discussed that there were two groups of people who were in prison. One of them I would consider that they, as people who had attended several meetings or they had read a book or this sort of thing. It was an imprisonment as a part of the suppressiveness of the regime extended to these individuals. I knew by and large that these people, by any definition, they are innocent, and everybody considered them innocent, and we're happy that these people would get out, and we would do everything possible to obtain release of these individuals. The second group are those that were actively involved in terrorism. I think that we didn't know what these students were doing. We didn't know what was their accusation or what they were accused of, and we didn't know how the court proceedings went. But we would know that these people if these people had received the sentence, we would know of the sentence if it was imprisonment. If it wasn't imprisonment, I don't know. Probably we would never hear about it.
You mean if it was just execution?
If it was execution, I don't think that there were that many kids who were executed. I mean, with the exception of Gol Sorkhi and others, execution following an official sentence was something relatively remote. Several people who were executed were those that they proved some sort of either belonged to the Gol Sorkhi group, or they proved that these people participated in killing somebody. The rest of them were killed in action. Or they had other stories also that, but sometimes they even never explained. I heard of one incident, and this incident was something like this, that one of these kids was on the campus, and I heard a strange story that suddenly a Savak agent that was trailing this guy, who was also on the campus, how I don't know, because we used to check everybody's ID card when they entered the university, suddenly started chasing him, and then shot and killed him in a street next to the university. This action took place in such a speed, and the body was removed. I heard this from one of the usual guards of the university who stands in front of the door. It was never in the paper. I was never informed of it. Nothing happened. So I don't know. I don't have a good idea about what would happen to such a person. But those who did select to join the terrorist organizations, I think they knew what would happen to them. I mean, this was something, and we were not at all involved with what happens to them or how they are dealt with.
What were the sentiments of the faculty and administration of Aryameh University when arrests or executions of their students became known?
Again, I have to distinguish between the two. The arrest has two parts. is one part has to do with the first group of which I don't consider really an accusation of any form. I mean, the guy had a book or participated in a meeting or something of this nature, which wouldn't be considered a crime in the West. Toward the first, there was tremendous feeling of compassionacy. The faculty wanted the students released, etc., etc. The second group, which are the terrorists essentially, the faculty had a feeling that these people, well, they knew what they were doing. And by and large, there wasn't that much feeling of compassionacy towards them. They said that these people have selected to pick up arms, they are killing, and they know that they are going to get killed. Now, of course, some of the ways that, or the stories that existed about torture, etc., didn't create also a feeling of compassionacy toward the regime. I mean, but you have to make a distinction between the arrest that is made on a kid because he happened to have a book that his teacher also has got it on his shelf. I mean, every guy who goes back, there are 2-3 books on his shelf that if the Savak would have come, would have considered them to be Ketabai Muzerre, and the guy would be subject to arrest. So I would say that the faculty had this dual feeling, but by and large, the faculty was really not, didn't have a feeling of distance between them and the students. And because 90%, 95% of the arrests were of the first kind, therefore they had a anti-government sentiment in this regard, and their feeling was leaning more toward the student who got arrested.
That brings me to, in fact, the next question, which is very much related. Was the topic ever discussed in a formal or informal meeting by the faculty?
Yes, in one case. In one case it was discussed, but usually, by and large, you couldn't have discussed them. I mean, the subject, if it came up, it came up informally rather than formally. The one occasion was that in 1950, after the police came inside the university and gave a beating to all the students and the faculty. I mean, the faculty at Aryama University was very young. I mean, it was just a few years older than the students. So police couldn't distinguish them. So when they came and started beating everybody, some of the professors also got a batum or two. At that time, there was a meeting of all the faculty members, sort of general, and the topic came up. As a result of that, all the faculty resigned, submitted resignation. And I was out of town. When I came the next day, I was selected as I was elected by faculty to go and try to find out because who was killed, because the students were saying that a large number of bodies were taken out of the university, and that's obvious because whenever there is an attack by police, a lot of people faint. I mean, they just faint. It's not a pleasant sight. You see a guy, for example, with helmet and the thing coming towards you, and especially women faint. Some of the boys even are, they're young, 17, 18, 19, they faint. Or some of them even they have concussion and they faint. So they saw a large number of bodies. Anyway, I was, the students were all in black, and I went after the students to hospitals and houses, etc., etc. In order to locate everybody. Anyway, I located everybody. Fortunately, nobody was killed, but this was, in this time, I got the chance to go inside the prison, and which I talked about later, before.
Okay. What was the origin of the establishment of university police or guard danishgahi? Who controlled the guard? What was the organizational relationship with the Chancellor and Minister of Higher Education?
The guards, university guards, were established in 1950, immediately after this famous beating at the Aryamer University.
I'm sorry, you mean 1350?
Sorry, 1350. After this beating, because this was the year that a number of things happened. Number one, Siyakal was formed. Number two, both at Tehran University and Aryamer University more, there were severe beatings of the students after they demonstrated against Shah and for Siyakal group. It was the year, the 25th anniversary of Shahanshahi was to be conducted. Anyway, the anniversary was in fall, but they had to tighten the system, essentially, for the fall occasion. And the terrorists started opposing the anniversary show, and in fact it was, the terrorists really became active in that year. In that year, in the summer of that year, in Ramsar, there was an annual conference in Ramsar, which all the high administration of the universities participated with government and Shah himself. Shah proposed the establishment of guard. I was under the impression that somebody in Ministry of Higher Education made the proposition, and they wanted to prevent this clash between police and students. So they say, why not just put the police inside? And anyway, Shah liked the idea, and anyway, it was inserted into the conference, what do you call it? Agenda. It wasn't discussed, but anyway, the conclusion was put in after Shah got angry because it wasn't in the it wasn't amongst one of the conclusions. Anyway, in that year, it was established. It said that guard is going to operate under the direction of the chancellor, but they had their own authority spelled out. That means that it wasn't although it was really I had the authority supposedly to ask him to leave the university at certain point, or go over there, or do this or do that. It wasn't at all clear. In fact, it was. It wasn't clear that I was their commander. Of course, they had a commander. I mean, their military commander was somebody who was stationed at University of Tehran. And when a university needed more force, instead of bringing people from police force or which were not accustomed to dealing with students, they wanted to have a group of police or guards that were accustomed to the student activity and this sort of things, and they would be well equipped. They were not armed. There were no firearms at all in their hands or in their possession. They had usually they had nothing to do with the rest of the students. They were primarily there to prevent mass demonstrations. Students' mass demonstrations. When I was chancellor, I remember once I found I was opposed to their existence. I don't believe that the university site is holy and no police should enter it. That wasn't the reason of my opposition. I was opposed to it because I was. This was by itself a sort of. It would be able to nucleate unrest very easily. All you had to do is to shout something. They would become. I mean, they would go on alert, and you throw a stone or something to a guy, I mean one of these police, and he would start chasing you. Once a police starts chasing a kid, the whole university is on the run. Now, this was, you could disrupt classes in no time if you wanted, and the police could never catch up with a guy in sneakers and this sort of things. I mean, the kid who was going to do that, he was wearing sneakers, I mean, and he was capable of running, loose clothes, and the police had all these heavy stuff with him, I mean, boots and this sort of thing. So the student would lose himself in the masses of the other students, and what would remain in the university was a large number of kids who have escaped from the guard, and the guard is essentially symbolizing the regime, and that wouldn't create any pleasant feelings amongst students. And you could disrupt classes, and I was against that and opposed to that. Anyway, when I wrote when I called the commander and I asked him that please leave and don't enter unless I ask you, he said I can leave, but I can't stay out. He said, well, leave then. And I asked him to leave, and a few days later he came with a letter. He says that I can't leave. I mean, you have to sign this letter that anything that goes wrong is your fault. And I signed that letter, and that letter must be somewhere. That I accept all responsibilities, and you just get out whenever I tell you. Later on, after revolution, one of the kids who was in charge of committee at Aryamel University, he called me, and he said that, do you know such a student called Farhang Darvishoui? And I said, yeah. He said he was a member of Savak. I said, okay, so what's new? He said that he was under direction at the time that you had asked the police, the guard, to leave the campus. He was under the direction to create disruption and tear down laboratories and this sort of thing. So that, well, they must have had some interest in the sense that they wanted to show to other universities that if you do this, then you are going to suffer the consequences. Anyway, that's what happened. That means SAVAK was acting essentially in a direction which was opposite to the direction of a chancellor. This is very funny. I don't know who was working for who.
Was there actually an unrest during the time that you asked the
Yeah,
security guard to leave?
when I asked the security guard to leave, I know that the opposition, the extremists, the terrorist groups, etc., they easily felt the danger. That is, I mean, if the guard was out, there would have been a compassionate feeling, or there would be a sort of a pro-government feeling or pro-university feeling, which would propagate amongst the students. And this was not good for them. So what they did, they started a series of actions that sort of escalated in order to demonstrate their opposition and entice me to bring back the guard. It's very funny, but I get the feeling, or I always had the feeling, that the SAVAK and the terrorists were made of the same material. They were the same fabric, only cut in half. Half of them were put in charge of controlling, and the other half in charge of opposing to that extent. And anyway, this series of actions included actually stoning my office, included of breaking, enormous amount of breaking windows and glasses in order to disrupt the university. The university did not disrupt. The students sat in the class, and they were going to disrupt examinations, and the students sat in the exam until the students actually kicked these activists out of the class. They said, just leave. And they wanted to, they said, you see, I mean, the students wanted to finish and graduate. Every time that there was disruption, the university had passed a regulation that the 16 weeks of education had to be delivered. That means disruption of classes doesn't mean that that part of the course would not be covered. The term would be extended until you cover all that. And in order to not lose the rhythm, we said that if the extension was more than certain amount, we are going to lose that term altogether. So the students wanted to stay, and to stay in the class and take the exams, and now with the absence of guard, it was the activist group that was trying to force them to leave classes, and they didn't want that. So the activists sort of escalated. They broke all the windows, they shattered laboratories, they destroyed libraries, but finally they gave up.
I'm sorry, were the activists Mujahideen?
Well, they were pro-Mujahideen. They were usually what happens is this, that the real Mujahideen were in the back. They would get some of these groups who have been recruited, and then they form them into activist groups that would go and do things for them. They were I would say, the workers of the hierarchy of Mujahideen. They were not the real sort of thinker Mujahideen.
If we may go back to one comment you made just a few minutes ago about SAVAK working against the chancellor and who's working for whom. What was the extent of the SAVAK's activities within the university, and how much were you aware of, or the chancellor was aware of what?
There was one thing that I was aware, and that was the personnel office had to submit every name of every applicant and special application to SAVAK for clearance unless that person was being employed on a short-term basis. So we had a number of people who were employed at Aryamet University who otherwise would not be by as temporary help, not as permanent. Usually they would take the name of a person, and then they would state that this guy had some activities abroad, and then we would I would convey, I mean, that message would be conveyed by our personnel office to me. I would talk to the chairman of the department, and chairman of the department say that we really need that person. So I ask personnel to prepare a letter to them that we really need that person, and upon receipt of a letter that says that I am responsible, the chancellor says I am responsible, they would permit the university to hire that. There were only few occasions that they really violently disagreed. Anyway, that was one activity. A second activity of SAVAK was totally unknown to us, what they were doing with students, either the students who were working for them or the students who were working against them. I mean, that part was totally unknown to us. And we had no way of even knowing what they wanted to do. In fact, many of the otherwise, I would say, natural trends, like the formation of that union, etc., it was associated with SAVAK. They said, hey, this is the mechanism that they are setting up in order to do this or do that. There was much more activities were associated with SAVAK than really involved SAVAK. But we were ignorant of the activities of SAVAK inside. Then the third was official contacts of SAVAK with the university, in which they would come and they would have a representative of SAVAK would come and would say something, and usually the stuff that they were saying was I met a guy who came once and said that they had information that one of the such and such person who was not really a member of the faculty was engaged in corrupt activities. And I said, what is the activity? He said, Dr. such and such, I don't want to mention his name, he made a firm and he obtained representation from another company, and he's buying the material from his own firm. So he would get, in a way, he would get kickback. Anyway, we told him that that person was not associated with Aryama University and was now in another organization. Anyway, that never prevented the progress of that corrupt individual, because he just went on and on, and I know. Anyway, but that was, for example, the type of official visits that they would have. I mean, it was a member would come and say something like this. Very similar. I mean, it looks like that an aspect of the work is of the universities of SAVAK was like FBI in this country, and was very overt, as opposed to covert activities. And the overt activities is what I call as official.
But during the time that you were either as a professor at Aryama University or as the chancellor, were you aware of SAVAK's activities, and did you think that they were working against you? Against you in the office?
Yeah, I think that there was, first of all, I was aware of the SAVAK activities because of so many arrests of the innocent students. And I was feeling that SAVAK is, as a faculty member, I was feeling that SAVAK is working I mean, whatever SAVAK stands for is essentially against my principles. But at the same time, I accepted the existence of SAVAK. That's SAVAK. When I was chancellor, I didn't think that SAVAK was working for me or against me. I mean, definitely I would say that they were so remote of the intricate problems of a university that they weren't working for me. They had their own goals and this sort of thing. They never worked. Also, I wouldn't really imagine that they would be working against me, because I thought that, I mean, this is stuff I told you is really came out after after the revolution and after I was released from jail.
So in other words, they were working against the office of the chancellor, but that
at least in this instance, I don't know, they had their own purposes and their own goals, and their own activities were geared to those goals and principles, etc. And definitely their concern was not proper functioning of university. That was my problem, whether education and research was done properly or not. They wanted quiet, I suppose.